Well, I guess it's recording.
Okay, let's start. Hi there, and welcome to this afternoon and this opportunity to get together and talk a little bit about some things that maybe are important and maybe have some real significance for who we are and why we're around. So, to start out, I just thought it'd be nice for us to each introduce ourselves, and I'll start with you, Tyler.
Well, as you know, my name is Tyler Peterson. I'm a recent graduate of Denver Seminary with a Master of Divinity degree. I work at an incredible organization called Effective Presentations that has lent us this studio, this galaxy. And I also work part-time at Colorado Christian University teaching people how to interpret the Bible, Christian formation classes, and doctrine classes.
Yeah, and my name's Rick Hess, and I teach at Denver Seminary. I am distinguished professor of Old Testament and Semitic languages there. With my wife, Jean, we co-pastor a small Celtic Christian church, and we're just so blessed to have 3 children and 8 grandchildren now. So it's been a great opportunity, and getting to know Tyler as well, and the ideas that we've shared as we talked about this. One of them is to produce something like this. So we thought, why not begin at the beginning with the book of Genesis, or at least with the text of the opening chapters of Genesis. Whenever I teach this course and begin with Genesis, I always think of how widely read this book is. In fact, I would say probably the opening pages of Genesis are the most widely read and reflected on material, written material, in the history of the human race. There just isn't anything that I can think of that has had more reflection, more study by more cultures, more people with more different religious backgrounds of all different sorts. And so it certainly is worth looking into, if only for that reason, but let alone also for what it has perhaps to teach us about why we're here, who God is, and what is the understanding of Genesis.
Yeah, that's excellent. You know, I was doing some Google keyword searches earlier to try to figure out what is the idea of Genesis most associated with in our culture. What do you have to pay Google to advertise the most? And your competition is cars.
Cars?
Cars, yeah. If you wanted to learn more about Genesis, you just typed it in, you would get a lot of car searches.
There you go. Well, I think about that, and you realize how common, not common, that probably isn't the best word, but distinguished a term like Genesis is. It carries with it a certain flair, a certain pizzazz, and yet at the same time, it isn't just limited to the story of the Bible and the beginning of the Bible. In fact, we talk about the genesis of this idea, or the beginning of some event or something else, and use the term Genesis often in that way. So perhaps it's not surprising that a word like Genesis, which is kind of unique, would come off in this way. Of course, the actual name of Genesis, the term, goes back to the translation of the Bible as we have it from the original language into the language known as Greek. And Greek, when the Bible was translated in the 200s and 100s BC, Greek was the language that was known right across the world, the Mediterranean world, and the whole area where the Bible was beginning and being read, particularly by the Jewish people, but also by others. And so the term Genesis, which means beginnings, is in fact a term that comes from the Greek language and was used to describe this book. Not surprisingly, perhaps, because the very first words in the original language are "in the beginning." That's Bereshit in the Hebrew, the original Hebrew, and that's how it begins. So it's not a bad way to start and to name the book.
No, it's not at all. And going back to the Google search idea, what beginnings is an extremely popular Google search Genesis, beginnings, if you pair it with evolution.
Ah.
And so that actually comes up very high in terms of what people are looking for. So you were telling me that to take a stance on evolution would be quite controversial. So, but why is that? And what do you think the main point of God saying the beginning?
No, it's a really important point, and it's one that people naturally go into, especially when they're starting off and looking at Genesis. In fact, the whole theory of evolution, as it's called, of course, traces its origins back to Charles Darwin in the 19th century. And Darwin and others around him, of course, were surrounded by a Christian environment and a church environment where the Bible held a really big authority. And so as soon as he began talking about where human life, where animal life, where all life came from, that directly connected with the book of Genesis. And people began by looking at Genesis and comparing and contrasting with what he was saying at the time. And that's been true ever since. Because as that theory and idea has caught on and become very popular, very influential in our whole understanding, I think to a great extent, of the world and its development and so many things in it, what we have really is this ongoing comparison and contrast with what the book of Genesis actually says, and how it describes the world and its beginnings, and also how different people interpret that. Because there are people who will interpret it and look at it and say, well, there's not a lot of difference in terms of what is being said with regards to the book of Genesis and what is being said with regards to Darwin, or at least the development of that theory as it's come down to us. And there are others who will say, no, there's no compatibility at all. You cannot really believe the God of the Bible and accept this. So I think one of the serious things we want to look at as we go forward is just to try to understand what is it that this book, and particularly the first chapter or so, what are they teaching? What are they telling us? Where are we going with this? And what's the point of it being there at all?
Well, that seems like a very relevant question. It seems for a lot of philosophies, they get their beginnings at how things were created. For example, I think of nihilism, and I think that evolution provided a really interesting starting point, maybe an enabling starting point for the idea that there is no meaning if we just come out from random purposes without God in some way directing it. If you go that direction, you get a world without meaning. And so if God created the world, then we have a world that has meaning and purpose. Was that something you would agree with?
Yeah, well, it depends how you understand God, but certainly the Christian God, the God of the Bible, is a God who is both intelligent and purposeful, and also who had an intent for and reason for the creation of the world as it is, and for the creation of the human race as it is. And right down to the present, God's creative work continues. We are created in the very image of God, and that has all kinds of implications for the biblical understanding of the value of human life. What is it worth? What does it mean? And it's sort of infinite worth in many ways compared to the material world around us. It has implications just for life itself, and God is the creator of life, and how important that is. And it has implications for where this world is going, that it's not only just it's not randomly created, but it is created with a purpose. Therefore, where's that purpose taking us? And is it already, at least in part, revealed there in the very beginning chapter of Genesis?
Well, then that would be a great place to begin then. So what does Genesis 1, God creating the world, mean for our purpose, and where does it say that we're going?
Yeah, and those are key questions, because if we don't have a purpose, then a lot of what Genesis is saying might have some interest, but it's not going to be the most reflected on passage or written text in the world. And as you think about that, think about what the text says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He had a creative purpose and a reason for doing it. It wasn't just helter-skelter, hit or miss. There was a purpose to it. And what is so interesting is that as you read forward in the opening verses of Genesis, it talks about he did such and such. He divided the light from the darkness, and there was the first day. And then he does some more things. He divides the waters above and the waters below, and there is day 2. And then there is this third day after some creation takes place. And in each of these cases, there is something being done. It's being done from the standpoint of a person looking and watching how God is working, but it's being done on day 4 and day 5 and day 6. And then day 7, God, of course, rests. Now, I guess he could have done that or described that in another way, using different things other than numbers. But I think this was intentional because it shows there's a sequence involved. It's not accidental. And however chronological we understand that, however we understand it in terms of time, there's something more going on. There's a kind of logical development as each day sort of gives birth to the next day. And each day moves us forward until on day 6 we have the creation of people, of the man and the woman. And then day 7 takes us into that day of rest, as though those 7 days of creation are all built into creation with it moving towards a purpose and towards an end. And that purpose and end isn't a great explosion or a frenzied activity or some super duper civilization or anything like that. It's rather rest. That truly, while in the creation there is work, and that is part of who we are as created, we are all, and the world itself is moving towards rest. It's moving towards an end, and it's built into creation from the beginning. And as though to remember that, God again and again calls his people back to rest every 7th day. If you want to become part of the order of creation, to become part with the sort of nature itself, one sure way of doing that from the biblical perspective is to take that 7th day, or 1 day and 7, and rest. And that is, the whole of the Bible is set in that way. It moves us forward. History, the purposes that God has created, they aren't simply to come back to the past and to somehow inhabit that. It's not a cycle. It's not a return to the past. Look at the next chapters that follow after the seven days of creation. And what you find is that Genesis in chapter 4, in chapter 5, in chapter 10, in chapter 11, and on, is divided up by what we sometimes call genealogies or family histories, where each generation gives birth to the next generation, to the next generation. And this is represented by specific individuals. And sometimes there's notes on them describing things that take place, and sometimes it just moves forward. But it is though God is watching over the world that he has created, and especially humanity, that there is no break in that. It begins and it moves forward, and we come to Noah, then we come to Abraham, then we come to Israel, and we come to the story of Moses, and the story then of coming into the land, and the kings, and all that takes place throughout the Bible of the Old Testament. And then as Christians, we come into the New Testament, and we see that Jesus comes as well. And the very opening of the Gospels in Matthew 1 and also in Luke are so set that they trace Jesus' own lineage back all the way, in the case of Matthew, all the way back to Adam. And that's not accidental, because there is this desire to show that Jesus comes at the right time, at the right place, and this moving forward in time. It's not to go back, but it's to go forward. And that's why at the very end of the Bible, at the end of Revelation, we have the description of a new heaven and a new earth. And it's as though all that has gone on before is a prelude to this time yet to come.
Wow.
And all of history moves us into that great time of rest, of peace, of God being everything to us, and of we being all to everyone, so that our purpose is truly fulfilled.
Well, that is epic. That is epic. So if I'm hearing you correctly, beginning back in Genesis 1, you have sequential days,
Yeah.
1, 2, up to 6.
Yeah,
Then we have the creation of humanity.
yeah, right.
And
right.
then
That's
on
it.
on the seventh day, you have a day of rest. And so far, the days of creation's purpose is building towards rest.
Yeah.
And you alluded to, it's not an explosion, it's not a big bang event, it's not a cataclysmic occurrence. Instead, it is this rest.
Yeah, and it's not like, from what we know of God as he is revealed in the Bible, it's not as though God got really tired and needed to rest. That's not the point of it. The point of it is God chose on the seventh day to rest, in order that he might show that all of creation is designed for that end.
Wow.
That's where it's going, and that's who we're about. Yes, we're about doing lots of things. We're about accomplishing goals and purposes that God has given us. We're about, in the New Testament, bringing in the kingdom of God as Christ has brought it. We're about doing all kinds of things in this world, but we're also about looking to a city, to an end, to, as Hebrews talks about it, whose builder and maker is God. And in chapter 4 of Hebrews, it talks about entering into that rest that God has created for us. It is an end that we can hardly imagine, and yet we have it. It's built into creation, and we have it designed every week. that we would remember that. That's why God put it there. Not because he was tired, but because that was his intent and purpose and the goal that he was moving towards.
Wow, so even in the creation days, our purpose is revealed to be restful. But then much history has passed. You have the entire sequence of the Old Testament. You have 2,023 years since, the birth of Christ. And so today, while our purpose is rest, we also have this kind of prophetic future hope of a city, of a new Jerusalem, of a, would I say, a more restful
Yeah,
future?
a new heavens and a new earth, yeah.
Because I think a lot of people would say life is not so restful.
No.
And why do you think that is? If God's created purpose is for rest, then why do we lack it?
Yeah, well, you look, it's a really good question. I mean, look at chapter 2 of Genesis, where the man and the woman are then placed in this garden. And yes, there is the responsibility to take care of it, to keep it. Verbs are used there, expressions are used there that are designed to show there was a purpose for the man to watch over the garden, and then the woman coming alongside of him, and the two of them together. But what you get a sense of even more is that they have this wonderful relationship with God, they have a wonderful relationship with one another, and they have a wonderful relationship with the world about them, the animals, the garden, the trees, all that is growing there. That the environment, the ecology, the climate is all working together. That what we have a picture of is perfect harmony. Harmony between the world, the earth, the ground, and all that grows up from it, the animals, the man, the woman, and God. And that's the ideal. And there, whatever is going on in terms of activity, the taking care and so forth, is never portrayed as dreary work and labor in and of itself. There is work, but it's as though the man and woman are living out their purpose and seeing that in the maximizing of the life that God has given them responsibility for, the life of the garden and all in it. But he's also given, from the very first creation with the man and the woman, this image of God. And the one thing about the image of God that is there is that we have the ability, as did the first man and woman, to make a choice for God or against God, to say yes or no to God. Because God wanted from the beginning that we would worship him, that we would take care of the world that he has placed us in, that we would enjoy one another of our own free will, and that we would truly be able to do it. Well, of course, then you get to Genesis chapter 3, and things don't turn out so good, because in what began there and what happened there, whereas decisions were made to turn away from God, and instead of saying yes to God, saying no to God. And that's been sadly the case of the human race ever since. And as that happened, there was a kind of destruction of that harmony. And so all the good things were lost in their perfect goodness. There's still something there. There's still something to restore. There's still something that is of value, but so much of it has been marred. And so when we look at things today, we don't find them as they were intended. Instead, the world is not the place that we had hoped that it would be, and that God had wanted it to be. But the world is something where we have turned our hearts and our wills against God and his will.
Well, that explains why we don't experience rest. Though we were created good,
Yeah.
though work was created to be life-giving,
Yeah.
that all these things should have given us life, and yet there is this presence of toil and of struggle.
And we were created to give life, to contribute to that life as well. To, as I sometimes say, maximize the life-giving potential of the garden. That's the whole operation of tilling and keeping and working the Garden of Eden. That's the whole ongoing operation of even God bringing the animals. Yes, it was to find a helper for the man, but also to enable the man to further provide an understanding of the purpose and significance of each of God's created creatures.
Yeah, and so, in other words, we were meant to know the purpose of all of God's created creatures, and I guess the question I'm wondering, you keep on suggesting this idea of purpose, that we're moving towards a purpose, and then you also talked about a choice that we had. We had the choice to choose, God gave us a choice to choose him or to choose our own way. How is that idea connected to rest?
Right. Well, I think part of this is that as long as the man and woman there chose the way of God, they chose his original intent for creation. And as they chose that, they could see and understand that everything was working together. And so there was no disruptiveness. There was no war or conflict or a lack of rest. Then you go forward in the Bible and you see with the wrong choices that are made, and as they pile upon one another and all the sins and wrongs and bad things that come into the world, that again and again there are these notes. For example, when God gives the land to the people of Israel and they come into the land and take it, there will be references where they will go out and they will fight their wars and fight their battles, and they will have victory, and they will come back and they will have rest. And there is this sense of finally, when acquiring the land, that they go into it and they have rest. And that rest there involved not only an end to the battles and the wars and the constant threat, but it involved fruitfulness. It involved the land bringing forth all that was necessary to eat and to drink and to live and to have a peaceful and really ideal life in many ways, taken the context and culture of that time. And that went forward generation after generation, but the people turned against God even there. And so they lost that land that they had been given and were cast out from it, and the rest that they were intended to have, they didn't have. So we come into the New Testament, and there is Jesus again, working to restore that, to bring it back, to take the greed and anger and hatred that so characterizes the human race and so many people in that day. And instead of that, to bring reconciliation, to bring about peace, to bring about healing, so that those who are ill in one way or another, Jesus healed them, so that those who fought one among the other, Jesus called them and brought them the possibility of reconciling differences. And he brought that reconciliation, that coming back into peace, into the world, and through his death on the cross and resurrection, in powerful and never repeated ways, he was able to bring the presence of God and that healing and that peace and that harmony back, at least in a small measure, although we still get it wrong a lot. But the promise is that that will move forward. And there will come a time when God will restore and bring a new heaven and a new earth. It will not be like the former things, but there will truly be that reconciliation and peace.
Well, that's beautiful. I think you've given us a great overview of the Bible, Dr. Hess,
Nice.
and how the beginning of Genesis can extend continuously in its relevance to Revelation.
Yeah.
And how our purpose as people is to rest. That's kind of the sequence of the days that it was pointing towards. And then you have this kind of illustration in the life of Israel of fighting and accomplishing for God, getting tired, resting from battle. So this cycle of work and rest, victory, kind of peace. And then Christ is the one who comes to try to ultimately restore and begins that work of restoration with his death and resurrection. Is there anything else that lays bare the relevance of rest for today? Or what would you say to someone who's tired today, someone watching this video and they say, okay, my toil has made me feel purposeless. My struggles have made me weary. How would you encourage them today out of Genesis 1?
Out of Genesis 1, I would say Genesis 1 gives us a vision of hope, a vision of something that is greater than anything we could come up with in our own minds and our own ideas. And the story of Genesis doesn't end with the first chapter. It goes on, and it goes on through the whole Bible, and it goes on today. And if it helps us to point us, as I think it does, toward the one who said, take my yoke upon you and learn of me. For, you're weary and heavy laden. Well, I will give you rest. And that, of course, is the words of Jesus. Yeah, it's a blessing. Hey, may you know some of that rest this week and some of the blessed life that God gives.
Amen.